Welcome. Today I'm going to read a story that I wrote a while ago. It's based off of a tale that can be found in Folktales of India. Let's see if you can see it there. Folktales of India from the Pantheon collection. And the name of the tale is Another Use for Artists. And I renamed it The Court Painter's Daughter, and I changed a lot of the details. It's a fairly long story, so I hope you'll bear in with me. And yes, so let's begin. In ancient times, before the chronicles had been set in order, there existed two kingdoms, one of the north and one of the south. The kingdom of the south was thickly forested with woods that spread around the periphery of the palace. The young princess of the kingdom liked to walk with her maids along the forest's edge. One afternoon, she escaped their notice and ventured deeper into the woods. She noticed, under a mangrove bough, a family of deer, a stag, a doe, and two young fawns grazing. She watched in admiration, not noticing the cries behind her or the trail of smoke that lifted over her head. It was not until the mangrove was enveloped in flames that she realized that she was in the thick of a forest fire. But she stood transfixed, staring intently at the deer in their plight. The doe nudged her young from side to side as the flaming boughs fell, and, finding no escape, curled her body around them to shield them. The stag ducked under a log and fled to freedom, while the fire engulfed his young family. The maids searched in desperation for their mistress, and, finally finding her, dragged her to safety. They set her unconscious on a cool bank near the palace garden. When she came to, she burst into bitter tears, both from the terror of the ordeal and from her conviction that she had formed, that all males were faithless. She vowed never to marry and subject herself to such treachery. The princess, named Raji, grew in beauty and wisdom. She had an expression with a placid brow that seemed to represent a virtuous calm, and to others, coldness. Many princes and lords sought her hand, but she held to her vow and rejected every one. Her father, not wishing to part with her, was more pleased than otherwise, and she never left his side, often accompanying him on pilgrimages or diplomatic meetings. But she was strict in shielding herself from the public eye and hid behind a curtain. One evening, while the king of the north was returning from a pilgrimage, he came across the king of the south, who was traveling with his son Daran. The two kings greeted each other courteously. A chilled wind blew from the north and knocked over Rajni's curtain. The king of the south averted his gaze, but Daran could not help himself, and stared directly at her. Without looking up, she withdrew from sight, but the damage was done. Daran was irrevocably in love with her, and swore she would be his bride. That evening he broached the subject with his father, but the king laughed at his son's desire. "She's unmarriageable. She's rejected kings and princes far above her. I won't see you among their ranks." The prince turned to his companions, other lords, princes, and counselors, and many of them having sought their hand themselves, they urged him to avoid her. Most adamant was his cousin Kamal, a lord and minister in his father's council. Kamal, though an able counselor, was widely considered a wastrel and a poor influence on the prince. But Daran, with his keen insight, sensed in Kamal a sensitivity and wisdom that belied his sarcastic temperament. 2 years previously, Kamal had sought Rajni's hand and had been cruelly rejected. "She has the tongue of a harpy," he said. "I would not wish her on anyone." But the prince soon fell ill and repeated his wish with a constancy that frightened his parents. They finally sent an embassy to the king of the north, along with a portrait that unfortunately resembled every royal portrait that had ever existed, and their suit was politely rejected. They attempted to shield the news from the prince, but he found out and rapidly declined. The king asked all of his counselors for guidance, but they could offer him little advice. In desperation, he turned to each member of the household, from the chief gardener to the court painter to the lowliest kitchen boy, all for nothing. But the court painter returned home that night and shared the story with his family. At the mention of the prince's state, his daughter Arandad paled. Though separated for several years, she and Darshan had been fast friends in childhood. It had not been considered inappropriate at the time for the young prince to take an educated though low-ranking girl as his companion. But as they grew into adults, their friendship was seen as unseemly, and they were separated. For the past 4 years, they had only met on rare occasions. The prince treated Arandad with utmost courtesy, which she viewed as great coldness, and withdrew further from him. But though their friendship had dwindled to nothing, she felt a lingering affection for him for the sake of their childhood together, and she begged leave to visit him. The king and queen thought that a visit from an old friend might cheer the prince, and granted her her wish. When Arandad caught sight of him, wasted and barely able to acknowledge him, she was horrified and knew that he had not long to live. She knelt beside him and whispered, "Whatever it takes, I will help you." She returned home and asked to visit a shrine in a distant province where her aunt lived, to give offerings for the prince's health. Her parents were surprised and at first wouldn't hear of it, but they trusted their daughter and soon relented. It must be known that Arandad was a great painter, greater even than her father, though she shielded his sacrament and the court out of respect for his position. That night she completed, entirely from memory, a portrait of Darshan in full health. It was a work of great beauty, with a remarkable likeness and brilliant color. At dusk, Kamal marched into his cousin's chamber. Darshan's manservant had left to find oil to light the lamps, and Darshan was alone. "I had to see it to believe it," said Kamal. "Look at you, pining over a worthless woman." But Darshan didn't answer, and Kamal flew into a rage. "Get up," he yelled, shaking him by his shoulders. "Enough of this." He yanked the prince's body from the bed, but Darshan simply fell into a heap on the floor. The manservant returned with the lit lamps, and Kamal saw clearly his cousin's empty eyes. Trembling, he guided Darshan back into bed and watched over him until dawn. At about the hour that Kamal left the prince's bedside, Arandad set out on her journey, with a maid and manservant to look over her. The second day of the journey, when Arandad and her maid were gathering water from a nearby stream, the manservant, hoping to make off with Arandad's satchel of gold, attacked them. When he attempted to bind them, Arandad slid the dagger from her belt, and, heart racing, she plunged it into his side. While he lay howling, Arandad and the maid mounted their horses and fled to safety. But when they had found a hidden grove, she was still uneasy, fearing that as unprotected women they would fall victim to the brigands that infested the forest path. As a man, she reasoned, she could travel in greater safety. She cut her long hair with its distinctive curl to her shoulders, and, in her haste, left her torn sari behind her. Her maid hesitated at first, murmuring that it was an abomination to dress as a man, but finally followed suit. Several days later, she reached the kingdom of the north. She met with Rami, the court painter, and showed him samples of her work. Impressed, he took her on as an assistant. When she had finally proved her ability, she revealed her secret and was allowed to live as a woman. The princess took an interest in a female painter, and they formed a kind of friendship, limited only by the sense on both sides that the other was hiding something. Rajani was indeed beautiful, as Arandad had heard, but not so cold and not so formal. Arandad was surprised by her sense of humor free of malice, and she was supposed, by all counts of her, to be explicably both humorless and disdainfully witty. Arandad could not wring the princess's secret from her, though she was sure, from hints and rumors, that there was something behind the princess's unwillingness to marry. She noticed that Rajani spent most of her time in the company of a single companion, an old nursemaid bordering on senility. The woman had a weakness for drink and sweet things, and using flavored liqueur, Arandad was able to pry the princess's history from her. She sat up that night and thought, wondering how to make use of the story, when an idea occurred to her. Arandad was permitted to paint a mural on the veranda facing the princess's quarters. It was a triptych depicting a young man staring mournfully at a lake, and as she worked, it quickly caught the interest of the court. The princess walked by it often, each time raising her eyebrows, but she was too proud to ask about it. Finally, her resistance worn down, she spoke to Arandad. "Who is that young man? And why does he look so sad?" Arandad sighed and descended from the ladder. "Ah, my lady, it's a sad tale. The young prince of our land will never marry, and with him the dynasty will end. Our prince is a meditative young man, and he used to sit every morning by the lake near the palace grounds and think. One day, soon after sunrise, he caught sight of a family of ducks, a drake, a duck, and their ducklings swimming in a row. He was horrified when he saw a bowman on the other side of the lake. He called to the hunter to stop, but the man did not hear him. The drake shielded the ducklings with his wings as arrow after arrow pierced his back. The duck flew to safety, and the next week the prince, recognizing her by her markings, saw her swimming with another drake. The prince, believing now in the fickleness of females, was sick to the heart and swore never to marry. No one could convince him to change his mind, and he remains unmarried, to our great sorrow." The princess's eyes grew wide with wonder, and Arandad knew that her story had had its effect. She made a big commotion over retiring to her studio for her next work. It was the portrait that Arandad had painted of Daran. The court, fascinated by the triptych, came in throngs to see it, while Arandad pretended to add decorative finishings to its side. There was an uproar over the exquisite technique of the portrait and the beauty of its subject. Raji refused to see it and forbid her maids as well, but they went in secret. The princess could hear their whispers through the veranda, and her curiosity was inflamed. One night, while Arandad sat up working, she heard a scratch at the door. She paused a moment, then returned to work, thinking it was only a mouse. But there was another scratch, and she opened the door to find the princess hooded in a dark cloak. Raji hurried in and looked from right to left. Arandad held back her laughter. "There's no need to worry," she said. "There's no one here." The princess shivered. "I shouldn't have come here," she said. "Not at this hour." Arandad smiled. "You've come to see the portrait, haven't you?" The princess nodded, blushing. "Wait," said Arandad, and she hurried to the side. She lit the oil lamps around the portrait and arranged it under the light. She lay over it a gauzy veil and a thick curtain. She led Raji to the studio. The princess held fast to her cloak as Arandad lifted the curtain. Raji squinted. I can't make out the image." Arandad lifted the veil. The princess gasped. Several moments passed, and Arandad lifted her eyebrows as if to ask, "Well, what do you think of it?" "The execution is very fine," Raji blurted out, and stumbled out the door as though dying. Arandad hurried to her bed, leaned against the wall, and, muffling her mouth with her hand, burst into laughter. The next morning, Arandad sent a courier with a message to her father, Daran, and the king of the south. If the prince still sought the princess of the north, her message ran, she would be his. She explained her story in detail. Around the same time, one of the king of the north's huntsmen, while out with his falcon, happened upon the hair and torn sari of Arandad and her maid. His heart stopped, for he knew Arandad and recognized her hair by its curl. He could only surmise that she had been attacked by some wild creature, and he brought the artifacts home in great sorrow. The court painter and his wife were devastated, and even the king and queen, though they had separated the girl from their son, were greatly saddened, for they had loved her in their own way. They wished above all to hide the news from their son, but it reached him nonetheless, and though nobody could make out his reaction, he was wounded to the core. Several days later, the courier arrived, with the news of Arandad and her success, and the court sprang to life again. The court painter's family wept with relief at the news of their daughter, and the king and queen foresaw the end of their son's trial, though they tried to break the news to him slowly, for they felt a shock, Even a joyous one could do him great harm. But again, he knew all in a matter of hours, and with tears in his eyes he sat up in bed. He recovered swiftly, and though still slender and pale, he regained the light in his eyes. After 3 days, though the court, the city, the kingdom begged him to reconsider, he declared his intention of traveling immediately to the kingdom of the north. So a grand retinue made its way to the north, while with the king among them, for he feared his son would overexert himself. And naturally with the king came his courtiers, and with the courtiers the ministers. The king sent word to Arandad that she should meet them at a certain place, a short distance from the capital of the north, so they could confer with her before the prince pressed his suit. A great feast was held, and Arandad was the guest of honor. The prince was confined to bed rest, but he came down nonetheless, against the advice of his doctors. Arandad saw with tears in his eyes that the danger was gone, and he would undoubtedly live. Daran greeted her courteously, as always, and she was disappointed. But she bowed to him before he was dragged back to his bed. The king asked before all his courtiers what he should give to her who saved his son's life, but she only shook her head. The king of the south, in high-flown language, granted her titles, annuities, and lands, but his words were mere humming to her. It should have been her moment of greatest triumph, but she was suffocated. She excused herself and wandered through the dim halls of the palace. Walking by a brightly lit door, she heard her name, Arandad. She turned and saw the prince, upright in bed. He rose slowly to his feet, and she heard him in a low whisper fight with the doctor at his side. "I'm well. I'm perfectly well." He met her at the door. "I would invite you in," he said, laughing, but the doctor, my prison warder, would hardly let me say 3 words. So they stood in the dim corridor, and he conversed with her, slipping into the informality of former times. She felt her heart rise, for she had won his confidence, and sink as well, for she would soon lose him. They walked the length of the hall and slipped outside where the moon was rising. There was silence, and his skin, so pallid from his long illness, nearly glowed. "Arandad," he said, "I want to make you my wife." She shook with alarm. "Prince Darshan," she said, "you must be delirious." He laughed, a laugh of health which belied his face. "I promise you, I'm fully in my right mind. I thought you had died, Arandad, and it was then I realized the foolishness of my long illness and my longing for some face I had seen in a fleeting instant. When I knew you to the very core of your being, I can be too withdrawn, even sullen, and in the years that have separated us, I've turned into a morose old man. Misguided, I was prey to that face, as I would have been to any other face forbidden to me. I need you, your energy, to sustain me." He took her hands, and she did not have the strength to withdraw them. "I thought you were lost to me, and when I knew you lived still, it was as though I had been reborn with you." "Impossible," she said quietly. "I mean it," he said. "No," she said, though her heart was breaking. "It's impossible that I should be your wife. Your whole family would scorn me. I would shame them, and in time be ashamed to you. I cannot aspire to be what I am not." She realized immediately how truly she had betrayed her feelings, if not through her words, then through the way she said them. "Arandad," he said, "you have saved my life, and in my eyes and in the eyes of my kingdom. My father will grant you a boon. You can have any title you seek, money or land. Give up all those things and take me instead, or take them and declare yourself fit for me." Arandad considered, for the scorn of the world was nothing to her, but she still could not accept him. "I have won you the Princess Raji, and in good faith I have deceived her. She loves you now, due to my actions, and you are honor-bound to marry her." The prince could think of no retort, and he realized that Arandad spoke the truth, and he could tell by the conviction in her voice that her words were in earnest. He kissed her forehead, and bowing his head before him, unthinkable in a prince, he returned to his room. The retinue descended on the city with great fanfare, and Rajni looked with interest on the approaching procession. She granted Darshan his audience, and they were alone, or nearly so, for the senile nurse sat embroidering in the corner. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "It is indeed a great likeness," she said, thinking of the portrait. "I have come," said Darshan, bowing his head, "with greatest respect to ask for your hand." "Respect?" said the princess, with a bemused smile. "You do not mean love?" "I will come to love you surely," said the prince, his head still bowed. "You honor me, prince," said the princess, "but I can't marry you." Darshan lifted his head in shock. He was relieved, but also, in truth, a little insulted. "You are still adverse to marriage?" Rajni laughed. "No, not any more. And I have Arandad, the painter from your land, to thank. A few years ago, before I had regular suitors, a young man came to win me. I had vowed never to marry, and the vow was still fresh in my heart. She told him then of her encounter with the deer in the forest. I believed then in the fickleness of men, and that they, with words of love, they spouted lies. I had been pursued before, but in an official way, a way that I could stomach. But the young man was adamant. He could not understand my resistance, and there was nothing I could do to quiet his declarations, and my father would not send him away. One evening at a banquet, he began to badger me. Why would I not accept him? So I gave him the first lie that came to mind, something that would sting him. I told him that I was a princess, the daughter of a king, and he was a mere hanger-on at some distant court. I told him that he was beneath me. I did not believe those things, of course, but my lies did the trick. Others had heard me, and humiliated, he left the kingdom. When Arandad came, she told me, through her mural, the tale of your encounter with the ducks, and how the duck had abandoned the drake at the fatal moment. Darshan had never heard this story, but he nearly smiled at Arandad's ingenuity. I often thought of your experience, and it occurred to me how just I had been. Both men and women have good qualities and evil, and I had been needlessly guarding myself. I thought often of the young man I had spurned, and thought of the pain he must have endured. And then that painting. Arandad presented me a portrait, supposedly the portrait of the prince of her land. But when she lifted the curtain, I saw the very face of the young man I had sent away. For Prince Darshan, it was your cousin Kamal, a minister now, I believe, who had loved me. Darshan looked up in surprise. Though there was a resemblance between Darshan and Kamal, it was not very great. Arandad in her portrait must have emphasized those features that they had shared. So I have Arandad to thank for opening my eyes, though perhaps I will suffer all the more for my self-awareness. I wish you the greatest happiness, Prince Darshan. Darshan bowed and left the room in wonder. Later that evening, while they were eating, Darshan turned to the king of the south. "Father," he asked, "to whom do I owe my life?" "To your mother and I," he said. "To anyone else?" The king thought for a moment. "I suppose to the girl, Arandad. Yes, to Arandad. And so our lives are already in a sense intertwined. Father, I mean to marry her." The king stared at him in alarm. "And the Princess Rajni?" Darshan did not want to admit he had been rejected. "The princess has caused me trouble enough already. The sight of her, after so much suffering, made me sick to my stomach." The king cursed his fickle son under his breath. "Now, after all this fanfare, you do not want her?" "If I do not have Arandad as my wife, I will surely die," said the prince, biting his lip to hold back a smile. The king opened his mouth to protest, but seeing his son still wasted, but eyes again full of life, did not wish to see him pine away. In earlier years, he would perhaps have been angry and dashed his plate against the wall in rage, but he was growing older and tired, perhaps, of the burden of keeping his son from dying. So, considering the love he himself bore for Arandad, he blessed the couple, and they were married and returned to their kingdom of the south. All the kingdom spoke of the bizarre behavior of the prince, but Arandad's renown spread, and she was greatly loved. After the wedding ceremony, Darshan took Kamal aside and told him Rajini's story. Kamal's brow darkened. "Why didn't you not tell me this earlier, when we were all in the capital of the north?" Darshan smiled. "I thought it would little interest you. You did say she was a worthless woman, after all." Kamal looked about him as though stunned. He ceased to think of Rajni as worthless, and immediately ordered his horses to be prepared for a journey to the north. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the story and have a lovely night.